Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Raghavan Pereira. In a move that could upset Pakistan, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping have agreed to undertake a joint India-China economic project in Afghanistan. The understanding was reached between the two leaders during the two-day informal summit which concluded on Saturday. As per the understanding, officials of both sides will identify the project in following up discussions and work out modalities. This will be a first such project in the war-torn country where China, while trying to expand its influence, has tacitly backed Pakistan, which has been accused by Afghanistan and the US of backing the Taliban and its most violent attacks in the country, destabilizing any attempts to restore peace. On this edition of India's World, we will try and understand what shape the India-China project will take in Afghanistan. Joining me on the program today are TCA Raghavan, former ambassador, Professor Pant, Head Strategic Studies, ORF, and Professor A.K. Pasha, Center for West Asian Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Professor Pasha, I'd like to begin with you. What do you make of the decision of India and China deciding to go ahead with a joint project in Afghanistan?
I think it's one of the most significant development in recent times. Although Indo-China bilateral ties have improved over a period of time, in recent times we have seen, the defense minister, the foreign minister, the foreign secretary, the
several high-level meetings,
national security advisor, then the prime minister's meeting yesterday, and the Chinese foreign minister, trade booming around $85 billion. But this initiative on the regional security issue, because for the last couple of years, India was feeling left out because of the United States tilt towards Pakistan on the Afghan issue. It's only when President Trump came to power that, we saw a new American strategy putting India on the pedestal as far as Afghan issue is concerned. But still, that transparency which India is looking for from the US policy, we see not much is visible. So now China, with its, economic policies, One Belt, One Road initiative, to which Afghanistan also is a party, looks at economic angle as crucial for stabilizing the situation in Afghanistan. Because a lot of projects like the TAPI and various other projects have been hanging fire because of this problem. And the Afghan government's willingness to engage the Taliban for eventual peace settlement, involving them in share of power, through various means, through political party which they have suggested, gives an opening for both India and China. Because China has been in favor of the engagement of Taliban for quite some time, whereas we had our own reservation.
Sure.
But given the regional matrix, where Russia and the Central Asian countries, Iran, Turkey, are also in favor of engaging the Taliban to see where they stand on the issue of peace, security, and stability. So in that way, this bilateral India-China meeting to look at the economic angle, I think, is a major breakthrough, because this is, for quite some time, we have not been cooperating jointly. Okay. In Syria, we cooperated in the oil search, ONGC, Videsh, but on Africa and other spots, we have not been cooperating. But impacting Indo-Pak relations, Pakistan-Afghanistan relations, China-Pakistan, this is a major breakthrough. I think it's a very good development.
Okay, a great development is what the professor is suggesting. Ambassador, why does Afghanistan matter?
Well, Afghanistan matters firstly because for the entire region, the deterioration in its internal security situation, which has continued unabated, is something of great concern to everyone concerned. Those who are its proximate neighbors and even neighbors who are further away, and in fact countries which are distant from Afghanistan. The central issue in Afghanistan remains one of internal security.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, regional efforts, international efforts, and even bilateral efforts have not really made a serious dent on. Even the events of the last few hours, the major terrorist attacks in Kabul today, those ones last week, all of that underwrite that particular factor. I feel that as far as this particular announcement, if indeed this is what has really been decided, because I'm not sure whether this is an authoritative statement or is it a press report we are basing this surmise on. In my view, it is to be seen as a confidence-building measure, primarily between India and China. I would be cautious about making too much out of it, although it is a very, very welcome first step as a confidence-building measure, showing that there can be a joint approach between India and China on issues, even where there are otherwise political differences.
Sure. Professor Pant, what shape do you see this project taking eventually?
Well, I think there have been a number of projects where the ultimate aim of all stakeholders in the Afghan conflict has been to build capacity of the Afghan state. And I think in that realm, there are multiple projects that India and China can potentially do. The issue has always been that our engagement with China, as far as Afghanistan has been concerned, have been severely limited because of what many in Delhi have seen China's propensity to often give Pakistani side of the story. And I think if you recall a few years back, in fact, when the Afghan conflict was beginning to emerge, there was a school of thought that perhaps Afghanistan would be in one place where India and China could potentially cooperate. Terrorism affects both India and China equally, and the regional security would affect both the countries equally again. But unfortunately, that did not pan out the way I think many had anticipated. So I think in that context, if Indian and Chinese governments are thinking of undertaking joint projects, it is a welcome step. It is a step, I think, which will reassure the Afghan government in particular, because they have been very concerned about the inability of regional actors to get their policies in place, so that at least there is some amount of coherence. And I think it will also, to some extent, help American national security strategy, South Asian strategy, because if you recall, Trump administration has been pushing India to do more. Now, India's capacity to do more is severely limited by what Pakistan, the mischief that Pakistan continues to create in and around Afghanistan. So I think if you can bring China on board, I think you remove that constraint to some degree, if at all you can operationalize the project on the ground, because then China, with its considerable leverage over Pakistan, can ultimately allow you to take a project like this to its logical conclusion. But I would think that both Indian and Chinese governments would be thinking in terms of building capacity of the Afghan state, because if Afghanistan has to survive as a functioning state, as I think almost all the regional powers want, then the capacity of the Afghan state needs to be bolstered. And I hope in that context we are looking at developing projects, concrete projects, and taking them forward by cooperating, by both India and China working together and cooperating.
Sure, sure. Professor Pasha, what is it that India and China will expect out of Afghanistan?
Well, number one, the cooperation of the government, any government in Kabul, is essential for successful implementation of any economic project. The elections are coming soon in Afghanistan, and Abdullah has already indicated that he will not be a candidate. But whoever emerges as the president of Afghanistan, as Ghani has already delineated, will have to talk to the Taliban. So whether there will be a national unity government in which Taliban would be a major player or a player, and how Pakistan reacts to that is related to that. The second one is China feels that through its BRI project, the cooperation of Afghanistan is very important. Although we have raised objection to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but through Afghanistan, they can link it to Iran. in case if there are problems with Pakistan, Balochistan, Gwadar, so on and so forth. So Iran, Afghanistan, China link becomes very important for them. So in that way, I think that is the second point I see why they are pushing. Because without India's cooperation, any project cannot really take off in Afghanistan. That is for sure, the Chinese know that. And we have also been taking reasonably good approach if we see the Dalai Lama and various other steps which Indian government has taken, on terror funding and Paris meet, grey list, and of course the nuclear supply group issue remains where Chinese have had considerable objection. But overall, I think I see China as pushing its economic agenda because much of the investments it has made in Central Asia may be affected if there is no stability in Afghanistan. So in that way, they have already roped in Iran and Turkey to their side, plus the Central Asian states. So if Afghanistan could be a matching example for them with India's cooperation, as has been pointed out, it can have a sobering influence on Pakistan.
Sure.
Because it is holding up. Much of the support to Taliban comes from Pakistan because of the strategic struggle for power India and Pakistan have over Afghanistan. And China is caught in this Cold War between the two South Asian neighbors. So now it has taken a decisive shift to have closer relations because China is also under pressure from the United States on various fronts, military, economic, political, notwithstanding the periodic meetings they have had. So in that way, they look as a win-win situation, not only on Indo-China relations, but also for their own economic projects in which they have pumped billions and billions. And they see that as a flagship. And to eventually succeed in Afghanistan, where the NATO, the Americans, many other players have tried to stabilize, but nothing much has been achieved over the last 18 years or so. So let's see how Indo-China cooperation in Afghanistan pans out, and let us see how things unfold.
Unfold, indeed. Ambassador, as far as the other player is concerned, Pakistan now, will Pakistan be jittery about what has happened over the weekend in Wuhan?
Well, I think they would be jittery in a general sense because they realize that India-China relations covers a very wide spectrum, has a considerable amount of depth, and any overall improvement in India-China atmospherics changes to some extent the regional equations. So to that extent, it is something which they will watch very carefully. At the same time, one should remember that the Chinese and the Pakistanis have very close relations, and the Pakistanis have an extent of dependence on China which is in many ways unprecedented, and the Chinese are conscious of that. So I don't think, given that level of understanding, they will be immediately in a panic mode. I think they have a good understanding of the way things are going to develop, and they realize the importance which China puts to resetting relations with India. So I don't expect any immediate fallout of this on Pakistan's behavior in Afghanistan in particular. But in the medium and long term, if we can multiply such steps, move India-China relations to a higher level, certainly the regional dynamics will be greatly impacted.
Indeed. Professor Pant, in December 2017, China had a meeting in Beijing between China, Afghanistan and Pakistan, trying to sort out Afghanistan and Pakistan's problem in the region. During that particular meeting itself, China was very particular that Afghanistan is part of the CPEC. So that said, are there concerns for India there?
Well, see, there have been concerns. China's role and the way China has operationalized its role in Afghanistan over the last few years has been a point of concern for many in Delhi, because in the initial phase, as I was earlier suggesting, there was considerable optimism that somehow Indians and the Chinese can work together for the betterment of Afghanistan. Now, it did not pan out the way many foresaw. And gradually, as as the relations between Pakistan and China have grown, and the dependence is considerable, as the ambassador pointed out, and it continues to grow. Just 2 days back, another tranche of money has been released for Pakistan. So I don't, in that sense, the larger strategic picture that Pakistan and that Sino-Pak relationship present for India does not change with this one meeting. And the idea that somehow Afghanistan also is central to what Pakistan and China were trying to do in CPEC also does not change, because after all, BRI is a project that Chinese have invested a lot and are thinking a lot about. But the issue is, if there are possibilities where Indians and the Chinese can potentially work together, it changes the dynamic on the ground for Afghanistan. And the more reassured Afghan government is about the ability of regional powers to pull through these turbulent times, I think the better it would be for them to engage, whether in a dialogue or whether it's on the battlefield. I think that the overall atmospheric change for the Afghan government. And the more confident it is, I think the more pressure it puts on Pakistan. So in some ways, what we are witnessing is are some moves in this chessboard which have the potential to change what is happening in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan. Again, I do not see any immediate transformation in what may happen on the ground or what Pakistan's strategy might be. I think given the relationship that they have, higher than Himalayas, closer, whatever the term that they use, sweeter than honey, etc., etc. I mean, I don't see that going away. After all, both Pakistan and China have a strategic interest vis-a-vis India, and also about in terms of the larger foreign policy. It's not going to change just because there is one informal meeting between the Indian leadership and the Chinese leadership.
Sure.
But I think the signals are important, and signaling is that there are avenues now that are being explored. And I think that in itself would change the dynamic quite significantly.
Right. Professor Pasha, taking the discussion forward, now what's at stake for India in Afghanistan?
Well, there are many. In fact, if you look at it, first and foremost is the violence and terrorism which has spread to all nooks and corners. I think that is of major concern, because that has actually prevented any government there or even foreign donors from reaching out to the people who are in dire need of various things. In the last 25, 30 years, they have seen nothing but war, destruction, killings, so much of pain and suffering the Afghans have seen. That boils down to peace and security. And in this, it has become very clear that no amount of foreign support to governments in Kabul would bring this, because of the Taliban, influence spread across. And third factor is without the cooperation of regional actors, be it China or Russia or India, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, all these, even Uzbekistan, for example. Just today, the Turkish president is in Uzbekistan, Tashkent, discussing the very same issue, Afghan issue, as Indian and Chinese leaders discussed yesterday. So there is concern among all of these regional players that unless the situation in Afghanistan is stabilized, it's going to impact all the players in the region. It has ramification beyond, as we saw in 9/11 and even in Russia. And the Chinese are equally concerned that instability there would impact the Xinjiang province, Urumqi, Kashgar. There are a lot of reports emanating that interested parties are training the Uyghur militants there, or other Central Asian militants being trained there for various purposes. So in that way, the regional dynamics, I think, changes, because both now India and China are seen as strategic partners to bring peace and stabilize the situation, not as rivals, as it is being portrayed that India is on the side of America against China. So that demolishes, this meeting puts India and China as major powers looking for peace, security and stability in a very important pocket of Asia, as heart of Asia, as Afghanistan is known as. So all of these efforts are now converging in the realization by the regional players and the global players that something drastic needs to be done. I think in that situation, this is a breakthrough.
Sure, sure. Ambassador, like the Professor pointed out in his earlier statement as well, trouble has been going on in Afghanistan for over 2 decades now. They've not been able to bring peace on that particular land. What's to say anything is going to change in the near future? Because you yourself mentioned about how the attacks have only intensified in Kabul and in Afghanistan over the recent past as well, with the Islamic State taking roots there in Afghanistan as well.
Well, certainly it is easy to be pessimistic about Afghanistan because despite all the efforts which have been made, both domestically in Afghanistan and by concerned regional players, there's no real political process on track which would suggest that, through a process of confidence buildings, maybe some internal stability or improvement in the security situation can be assured. So clearly there is much to be pessimistic about. But for those very reasons, we have to keep trying. For the Afghans, it is not an academic choice. It's a choice of life and death. And certainly for anyone who is in the government or who aspires to be in the government, the central issue is how to bring about greater internal stability for its neighbors and especially for India. If you look at our own security environment, clearly an internal Afghanistan peace process and internal Afghanistan meeting of minds is something which will be entirely in our interest, because from 1979, with the entry of foreign forces in Afghanistan, our own security environment has been transformed beyond all measure. So on our part, we have to keep trying, no matter what the odds are, to see that we do what we can to bring about greater stability.
Indeed. Professor Pant, like Professor Pasha mentioned, what happens in Afghanistan has ramifications around the world, and that's why you have so many key players there within Afghanistan itself. We haven't spoken much about the US, Russia and Iran. What role do you see them playing going forward?
Well, potentially very, very important. And I think as the Trump administration clearly has articulated a very powerful statement of intent with their South Asia strategy, that this is what they intend to do. And I think in that context, the American role has been, one is looking at the American role in an entirely different context, where at one point the debate was all about withdrawal. The debate is still about withdrawal, but I think the larger sense is that Americans want to be there at least to see the transition through. So it's not about withdrawal at any cost.
As America withdraws, is China filling up those spaces?
Well, the issue has always been that who will fill the vacuum. And in some ways, the Chinese have already taken the lead by either organizing various trilaterals or by, as you mentioned earlier, this idea that by hosting Afghan leadership and Pakistani leadership and trying to arrange something with them in terms of just bilateral and trilateral engagement. See, the issue has always been that despite Afghan government's best efforts, Pakistan policy continued to be very obstructionist. So if you recall that Mr. Ghani himself, when he came to power, was seen as a very pro-Pakistani leader. He wanted to reach out to Pakistan from the very beginning. Now, Pakistan not only snubbed him, but also derailed the process that he had initiated in the first phase of his, of his presidency, and which meant that later on he had to take a very, very negative stance against Pakistan. So any country today which is seen as having potential to bring Pakistan back to the table with some degree of sensitivity about Afghan concerns is China. And I think that is why China's role becomes important, that one is not only looking at China to fill the vacuum, but also one is looking at China to see if it can put some sense into Pakistan insofar as how do you move forward. Now, unfortunately for India, in the past, our efforts with China have not been very, very fruitful. For example, a counter-terror dialogue that was initiated precisely because of Afghanistan, has not gone very, has had great difficulty moving forward, because the moment we mention Pakistan, they sort of leave the table.
Yeah.
Just speaking metaphorically. But I think that issue remains the most important one. How do you deal with what Pakistan is doing in Afghanistan, and how can you leverage Pakistan's ability to create mischief? How can you leverage Chinese ability to shape Pakistan's ability to create or not to create any mischief in Afghanistan? I think most of the regional stakeholders now believe that China perhaps can do that. And in this case, what we are trying to do, for example, the statement that the two prime ministers was released after the prime minister's visit was not only about this particular project, but it was also about regional security.
Yeah.
And in that sense, if the two countries now see a need for India and China working together for greater regional security, that is also an illusion that certain issues like terrorism, for example, need to be worked at a pan-regional level. It can't simply be a silo-based approach. China cannot expect that its terrorism problem in Xinjiang will disappear without actually making sure that Pakistan delivers on the ground. So I think there are issues where across the region there are possibilities of cooperation, and this is perhaps one of the ways in which India is signaling that it is willing to go ahead with China on these critical issues.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. You can share your feedback with us. The email ID, of course, is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.